What if I told you that somewhere in this world, hidden away from public view, there's a portrait so disturbing that it was pulled from a major auction house at the last minute? Not because it wasn't valuable, not because it was a forgery, but because everyone who came near it reported the same chilling experience. An overwhelming sense of dread, strange visions, and what witnesses described as malevolent energy radiating from the canvas itself. The subject of this cursed painting? None other than Hollywood legend Elizabeth Taylor, captured at the height of her beauty and fame in 1963. And here's the twist that'll keep you up at night. Since that fateful auction day over 60 years ago, no one has seen this portrait again. It vanished. Completely. As if it never existed. But the stories remain. And today, we're diving deep into one of the art world's most disturbing mysteries. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear gets darker with every minute. Picture this. It's 1963, and Elizabeth Taylor is at the absolute peak of her powers. She just won an Oscar for Butterfield 8. She's filming Cleopatra with an unprecedented budget, and her tumultuous romance with Richard Burton is making headlines around the globe. She's not just a movie star, she's the movie star. The most photographed woman on earth. The most desired, the most talked about, the most everything. Naturally, everyone wants to capture her essence, to preserve that legendary beauty for eternity. Enter a relatively unknown artist whose name has been lost to time, or perhaps deliberately erased from history. We'll get to why that matters in a moment. This artist, let's call him the painter, since records of his actual identity have mysteriously disappeared from gallery archives, received a commission that any artist would dream of. Paint Elizabeth Taylor. He was given access to private sittings, allowed to study her face, her expressions, her energy. By all accounts, he was obsessed with getting it right, with capturing not just her physical beauty, but something deeper, something he called her true essence. He worked for months, barely sleeping, barely eating, pouring everything he had into this single canvas. His friends said he'd changed during the painting process. He became withdrawn, paranoid, talking about how he could feel something coming through the portrait, something that wasn't quite Elizabeth, but something using her face as a doorway. When the portrait was finally completed, those who first saw it had mixed reactions. Some said it was breathtaking, the most accurate capture of Elizabeth Taylor's magnetism ever created. But others, and this is where things get interesting, others said it felt wrong. They couldn't quite articulate why. The technique was flawless, the likeness was uncanny, but there was something in the eyes. Something in the way the painted Elizabeth seemed to follow you around the room. Not with the playful illusion of perspective, but with genuine intent, genuine awareness. One gallery assistant reportedly refused to be alone in the room with it. She quit her job rather than spend another day near that canvas. The portrait was scheduled to be auctioned at a prestigious house in New York City. The pre-auction buzz was enormous. Collectors from around the world were preparing to bid, with estimates suggesting it could fetch $250,000, a staggering sum in 1963. The painting was displayed in the preview gallery for potential bidders to examine. And that's when everything fell apart. But before I tell you what happened during those preview days, what happened that caused the auction house to pull the painting in a panic, I need you to understand something crucial about the artist himself. Because 3 weeks after completing the portrait, the painter was found dead in his studio under circumstances that police officially ruled as suicide, but that those close to him swore was impossible. The artist's death scene was disturbing, to say the least. He was discovered slumped over his easel, which held a blank canvas. Not a suicide note, not a final painting, just pure white emptiness. His hands were covered in paint, red and black, smeared across his clothes, and the floral patterns that investigators noted looked almost ritualistic, though they dismissed this observation in their official report. His eyes were open, and according to the first officer on the scene, they held an expression of absolute terror. The coroner determined he died of a massive heart attack, likely brought on by extreme stress or fear. He was 32 years old, with no history of heart problems. His last words to his landlord, spoken just hours before his death, were chilling. "It's finished with me now. It's moved on. God help whoever it chooses next." Nobody understood what he meant. Most assumed the stress of creating such an important work had driven him to some kind of nervous breakdown. The art world mourned briefly, then moved on. After all, tragic artist stories are practically a genre unto themselves. But here's what makes this different. What makes this story transform from sad to sinister. Every single person who had prolonged contact with that portrait after the artist's death reported similar experiences. We're not talking about one or two suggestible individuals. We're talking about hardened art dealers, skeptical collectors, auction house professionals who'd seen thousands of paintings. People who didn't believe in curses or ghosts or anything supernatural. And yet, one by one, they all said the same thing. During the preview week before the scheduled auction, the painting was displayed in a well-lit gallery alongside other high-value lots. The auction house had positioned it prominently, knowing it would be the star of the sale. For the first day, everything seemed normal. Potential buyers came and went, examining the portrait, making notes, discussing its provenance and artistic merit. But by the second day, the whispers started. A wealthy collector from Boston spent 15 minutes studying the painting and then abruptly left the building, telling the front desk he was withdrawing his bid. He looked pale, shaken. When pressed, he would only say that the painting had given him a severe headache and a sense of overwhelming sadness that he couldn't shake. Then came the incident with Margaret Chen, a respected art curator from the Metropolitan Museum. She was examining the portrait, taking detailed notes for a potential acquisition, when she suddenly stumbled backward and began screaming. Security rushed over to find her pointing at the painting, tears streaming down her face, saying over and over, "She's trying to tell me something. She's trapped." She's screaming, but no sound is coming out. Margaret was a rational, composed professional with over 20 years in the art world. She'd never had a hysterical moment in her entire career. But after that day, she refused to discuss the portrait and reportedly had nightmares about it for months afterward. The auction house management held an emergency meeting. They were facing a dilemma. On one hand, the controversy was generating enormous publicity. The painting was now infamous, which in the art world often translates to increased value. Collectors love a good story, even a dark one. On the other hand, they were starting to have concerns about liability. What if someone had a genuine medical emergency in front of the painting? What if the negative attention damaged their reputation? They decided to continue with the auction but move the portrait to a less prominent position and assigned a staff member to monitor it continuously. That staff member was a young man named Thomas Whitmore, and what happened to him during his night shift would ultimately seal the painting's fate. Thomas was 24 years old, working his way through graduate school with night shifts at the auction house. He was a practical guy, studying accounting, with no interest in art beyond its monetary value. When his supervisor assigned him to watch the Elizabeth Taylor portrait overnight, he laughed. He'd heard the rumors, sure, but Thomas didn't believe in supernatural nonsense. A painting was a painting. Canvas, wood, pigment, nothing more. He settled into his chair with a thermos of coffee and a textbook, planning to study through the quiet hours. The portrait hung on the wall about 15 feet away, illuminated by a single spotlight. For the first hour, everything was fine. Thomas read, took notes, occasionally glanced up at the painting to make sure it was still there. Standard security protocol. But around 2 in the morning, something changed. Thomas would later tell his therapist that he first noticed the temperature drop. The gallery had been comfortably warm, but suddenly, he could see his breath forming small clouds in the air. He thought maybe the heating system had malfunctioned, nothing unusual for an old building. Then he heard it, a sound so faint he almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. Whispering. Not words he could understand, just the cadence of a voice, feminine and urgent, coming from the direction of the painting. Thomas stood up, his rational mind trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe pipes in the walls, maybe wind through a crack in the window, maybe his imagination amplified by lack of sleep. He walked toward the portrait to investigate. This is where Thomas's account becomes difficult to hear without feeling a chill run down your spine. He said that as he approached the painting, the whispering grew louder, and he could make out a single phrase being repeated over and over. "Let me out, let me out, let me out." But here's the thing that broke Thomas, the thing that made this educated, skeptical young man abandon his post and run screaming from the building. The voice wasn't coming from behind the painting or from some hidden speaker. It was coming from the painted lips of Elizabeth Taylor herself. And as he watched, frozen in terror. Those painted lips were moving, slowly, deliberately, forming the words he was hearing. The eyes, those violet eyes that had captivated millions on the silver screen, were now fixed directly on him, and they were filled with desperation and rage. Thomas ran. He didn't grab his coat, didn't lock the doors, didn't follow any protocol. He just ran out into the freezing New York night and kept running until he collapsed 3 blocks away, where a police officer found him hyperventilating and incoherent. When security arrived at the auction house the next morning, they found Thomas's chair overturned, his textbook lying open on the floor, and his coffee spilled across the marble, leading in a trail toward the exit as if he'd knocked it over in his desperate flight. But the painting itself appeared completely normal, beautiful, serene, perfectly still. Just Elizabeth Taylor's face captured in oil and canvas, with that enigmatic, almost smile that revealed nothing. The auction house directors made their decision immediately. The painting was withdrawn from sale. No explanation was given to the public beyond a vague statement about concerns regarding provenance. But internally, the message was clear: get that thing out of here. The question became, what do you do with a painting that nobody wants, that terrifies everyone who encounters it, but that's too valuable and too connected to a major celebrity to simply destroy? You certainly can't throw it in a dumpster. You can't donate it to a museum without explaining why you're giving away something worth a fortune. And you absolutely cannot let word get out that your prestigious auction house is afraid of a painting. So they made a choice that would ensure this portrait disappeared from history. They called in a private art dealer, someone who specialized in discreet transactions, the kind of person who could make problematic pieces vanish into private collections without questions being asked. His name was Vincent Corso, and he had a reputation for being utterly fearless and completely amoral. If you needed a stolen Rembrandt moved across 3 countries, Vincent was your man. If you needed a forgery authenticated through creative paperwork, Vincent knew people. He'd handled everything from Nazi-looted art to pieces involved in murder investigations. A supposedly haunted portrait of Elizabeth Taylor? That was just another Tuesday for Vincent Corso. He arrived at the auction house with his usual confidence, ready to negotiate a price and arrange transport. What he wasn't ready for was what he felt the moment he entered the room where the painting was stored. Vincent later told his associate, and this conversation was recorded because his associate was wearing a wire for an unrelated FBI investigation, that walking into that room was like walking into a wall of pure hostility. He described it as the feeling you get when you know someone hates you, when you can feel their eyes burning into your back, except amplified 1,000 times. Every instinct screamed at him to leave. His hands started shaking. His vision blurred. But Vincent Corso hadn't built his career by backing down, and he certainly wasn't going to let a painting intimidate him. He approached it, studied it with his expert eye, and had to admit it was extraordinary work. The technique was flawless. The likeness was uncanny. Elizabeth Taylor's famous beauty was captured perfectly, but there was something else there too. Something the artist had painted into her expression that Vincent couldn't quite define. It wasn't malevolence exactly. It was more like awareness. Like the woman in the portrait knew she was trapped and was looking for a way out. Vincent agreed to take the painting off the auction house's hands for a fraction of what it should have been worth. He had a buyer in mind, a reclusive collector in upstate New York who specialized in unusual pieces and didn't ask questions. The transport was arranged for the following evening. The painting was to be crated, loaded into Vincent's van, and driven to its new home under cover of darkness. But Vincent made a critical mistake. He decided to store the painting overnight in his own apartment, a converted warehouse space in Brooklyn where he kept his most valuable inventory. He'd done this hundreds of times before with pieces worth millions. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. Absolutely everything. Vincent lived alone, which probably saved other lives. He brought the painting into his apartment around 9 p.m., leaned it against the wall in his main gallery space, and poured himself a drink. He remembers putting on some jazz music, Miles Davis, and settling into his leather chair to admire his new acquisition. Despite the stories, despite the feeling he'd had at the auction house, Vincent was determined to prove to himself that it was all psychological, all suggestion and rumor, with no basis in reality. He sat there for maybe 20 minutes, sipping his whiskey, looking at Elizabeth Taylor's painted face. and then the music stopped. Not faded out, not gradually decreased in volume, just stopped, mid-note, as if someone had cut the power. Except the lights were still on. Vincent stood up to check his sound system, and that's when he heard her voice. Not whispering this time, not faint or ambiguous. Clear as a bell. Coming from directly behind him, Elizabeth Taylor's distinctive voice. That voice known to millions from a dozen classic films. Saying his full name, Vincent Michael Corso. He spun around. Nobody there, just the painting. But now the painted eyes were looking in a different direction than they had been moments before. Vincent wasn't a man who scared easily, but he also wasn't reckless. He grabbed his car keys and his phone, and he walked straight out of his apartment, leaving the door unlocked, leaving everything behind. He checked into a hotel and didn't return until the next morning, bringing two of his biggest, toughest associates with him for moral support. When they entered the apartment, they found it in complete disorder. Furniture overturned, papers scattered everywhere, and his collection of valuable artworks, pieces worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, removed from the walls and lying damaged on the floor. But the Elizabeth Taylor portrait? It was exactly where he'd left it. Untouched, perfect, leaning calmly against the wall as if nothing had happened. And here's the detail that made Vincent's blood run cold. In the chaos, a clear path had been created. From where the painting stood, a corridor of undamaged floor led directly to the door, as if something had walked out, or tried to, before being pulled back. Vincent called the collector in upstate New York and canceled the deal. He didn't care about losing the money. He wanted that painting out of his life immediately. But now he faced the same problem the auction house had faced. What do you do with it? He couldn't sell it through normal channels without the story getting out. He couldn't destroy it because despite everything, it was still a masterwork worth a fortune, and destroying it felt somehow risky, like breaking a seal that was barely holding something back. So Vincent did what people in his line of work do when they need something to disappear completely. He called in a favor from someone who specialized in making things vanish. A man known only as the custodian, who ran a private storage facility for items that were too controversial to keep, too valuable to remove, and too complex to sell. The custodian's facility was located somewhere in rural Pennsylvania, though Vincent was blindfolded during the drive and couldn't say exactly where. It was an old Cold War bunker converted into climate-controlled storage for the kind of items that exist in uncertain areas of legality and reality. Art, rare items, documents from unresolved cases, things that collectors needed to keep away from the public for personal reasons. The Elizabeth Taylor portrait was crated, sealed, and taken to this facility in the dead of night. Vincent watched as it was carried down into the underground storage area, placed in a vault, and locked away. The custodian charged him $20,000 for indefinite storage. Vincent paid without haggling, just grateful to be rid of it. But the story doesn't end there, because the custodian kept records, minimal records, but records nonetheless. And according to those records, which came to light briefly during a federal investigation in 1987 before mysteriously disappearing again, the Elizabeth Taylor portrait was stored in Vault 7 from November 1963 until March 1964. Then the record simply says, "Item removed by original owner. Storage fees paid in full." Original owner, but the artist was gone. Elizabeth Taylor herself had never commissioned the painting and claimed she'd never even sat for it. So, who was the original owner? Who came to that secret facility and claimed the painting? And more importantly, where is it now? This is where the trail goes completely cold, and where the mystery transforms from intriguing history into active urban legend. Because over the decades since 1964, there have been sporadic reports, unverified sightings, whispered stories in the art world about a portrait of Elizabeth Taylor that appears in private collections for brief periods before vanishing again. A collector in London in 1979 supposedly had it for 3 weeks before his mansion was lost under mysterious circumstances. The painting remained unharmed. The owner was not so fortunate. A gallery in Tokyo claimed to have it briefly in 1991, displayed it for exactly 1 day before the owner suffered a complete mental breakdown and was institutionalized. The staff refused to speak about what happened, but the gallery closed permanently within a month. In 2003, An anonymous bidder at an estate sale in New Orleans purchased a portrait matching the description. But when investigators tried to track down the buyer after the seller died under suspicious circumstances, they hit a wall. The buyer's information was fake. The payment was made in cash. The painting vanished once again into the shadows. And then there's the most chilling report of all, from 2011, just months before Elizabeth Taylor herself passed away. A nurse at the hospital where Elizabeth was being treated for congestive heart failure reported something strange. Late one night, she entered Elizabeth's room to check her vitals and found the legendary actress sitting up in bed, staring at the wall with an expression of pure terror. The nurse asked what was wrong, and Elizabeth, weak and struggling to breathe, pointed at the blank wall and whispered, "It's here. After all these years, it finally found me. I can see it hanging there, watching me, waiting." The nurse saw nothing but empty wall. Elizabeth died 3 days later. The official cause was heart failure, but that nurse, in an interview with a paranormal investigator years later, swore that something else had been in that room, something that had come to collect what it believed was owed. Now you might be thinking this is all folklore exaggeration, stories that grew in the telling. And maybe you're right. Maybe there's a perfectly rational explanation for everything. Maybe the painting is sitting in some climate-controlled warehouse right now. Just canvas and paint, harmless and forgotten. But here's what keeps me up at night. Every single person who encountered that portrait, from the artist who created it to the security guard who fled, screaming, to Vincent Corso who paid $20,000 to never see it again, all of them described the same thing. Not just fear. Not just uneasiness. They all said the painting was aware. They all said Elizabeth Taylor's eyes in that portrait were looking at them with intention, with purpose, with hunger. They all said it felt like something was using her image as a window, trying to push through from somewhere else. And the question that haunts every collector, every art historian who knows this story, is simple. Where is it now? Is it in a vault somewhere, locked away and forgotten? Is it hanging in some private collection, its current owner too terrified or too proud to admit what they possess? Or is it still moving, still changing hands, still leaving a trail of broken minds and mysterious deaths in its wake? The art world is full of secrets. Pieces go missing all the time. Private sales happen in the shadows. And sometimes, just sometimes, an artwork becomes something more than the sum of its materials. Sometimes paint and canvas and the obsession of a troubled artist can create a doorway. And sometimes, something walks through. If you're watching this and you know something about the Elizabeth Taylor portrait, if you've seen it or heard credible information about its whereabouts, I want to hear from you. But I'll be honest, part of me hopes it stays lost. Because some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some doors are better left closed. And some paintings should never have been created in the first place. If you found this story as fascinating and disturbing as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the strange, the unexplained, and the downright terrifying. Drop a comment below telling me what you think happened to the portrait. Do you believe it's cursed? Do you think it's still out there? And most importantly, would you want to own it if you had the chance? Share this video with anyone who loves unsolved mysteries and art world secrets. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and maybe don't stare too long at any portraits of beautiful women. You never know what might be staring back.